In the same way that the internet has changed the world, in the same way social media has encircled the world with invisible threads, creating online international communities, the Victoria from Magellan's fleet did something similarly extraordinary 5 centuries ago. It brought people together. NASA scientist Alan Stern, leader of its New Horizons interplanetary space probe, notes, quote, "When the first ship circled the planet, that sort of meant that we now had our arms around the planet for the first time," he said. "That just transformed humanity, in my view. I would call it the first planetary event, in the same way that Yuri Gagarin was the first off-planetary event." And that's a reference to the Soviet cosmonaut, the first man who went out into outer space. And so, yes, this changed the world. But we're only halfway through our story. Before we get to the rest of this narrative, if you haven't already subscribed to the Team Peachtree channel, please do. We are very affirmative here, and we discuss really inspiring affirmative sort of subjects. So if you're interested in that, then please subscribe. You can also like, share, leave a comment instead of this video, and let's get started. So where were we? Magellan is headed to a simple rookie mistake. It's a mistake that's going to cost him his life. And he is struggling in terms of a lack of critical thinking. He's been told not to proselytize, but damn it, Magellan wanted to proselytize. And then guess what happened? He exceeds the mission parameters. And so what happened after that happened? A battle. So when you think of the moment the ships enter the Pacific, bearing in mind the exhausting, depleting, deadly voyage that simply involves month after month after month after month at sea. So it ended up being 3 months, 20 days at sea. That's a long time, quarter of a year. This is what lies at the end of it, or over a third of a year. A battle. Bloodshed. So imagine how this journey to death and disaster starts. It starts with a fairy tale sense that all is well with the world. So let's start in the South Pacific and work our way up and across, shall we? So 3 tiny wooden European ships enter the colossal Pacific for the first time ever on November 28th, 1520. It was a Sunday. After the churning froth off the coast of Patagonia, Magellan decides the sea on the other side suits him a lot better, and he names it Pacifico, which means passive or soothing or peaceful. And although we know the Pacific today as the Pacific, thanks to Magellan, it was actually known as the Sea of Magellan for 200 years following Magellan's quote-unquote discovery. Magellan and his crew were in a good mood because they assumed they were just days away from reaching their destination. Alas, this was another big mistake. The nomenclature we see here, not just Pacifico, but calling the westernmost cape behind them the Cape of Desire, and the one before that the Cape of 11,000 Virgins, that should give you a sense not only how big the moment was for all aboard, but also that in their warm and fuzzy approach to the world, they were about to take a beating. The Daily Beast provides a good summary of the next part, and this is a quote from that article. Now the true horrors set in. After sailing for 3 months and 20 days without taking on board provisions or any other refreshments, Pigafetta tells us they ate only biscuit turned to powder, all full of worms and stinking of the urine which the rats had made on it, having eaten the good. And we drank water impure and yellow. We also ate ox hides, which were very hard because of the sun, rain, and wind. And we left them 4 or 5 days in the sea, then laid them for a short time on embers, and we ate them. And of the rats which were sold for half an ecu apiece, some of us could not get enough. A strange disease, scurvy, was spread among the crew. Their gums swelled to the point of overwhelming the teeth in both jaws, preventing them from eating. A score of sailors died of the disease, as did a Patagonian giant who had joined them and was cared for by Pigafetta. So basically Magellan's crew arrived in the Philippines filthy and fraught. In other words, perfectly primed to engage in a battle with the native tribes where they would lose hopelessly. In the spring of 1521, the expedition landed on the island of Cebu and reached an alliance with its king, who converted to Christianity and swore allegiance to the King of Spain. With that, all the inhabitants of the island were baptized. So you can actually see what's going on here is they're going off script. They're going off mission. They're exceeding their mission parameters. They're trying to evangelize when their job was just to find a route, get the spices, and come back. And so they actually, through their efforts, they convinced the inhabitants of the island to be baptized, to demolish their idols, and put an end to all of their strange rituals and ceremonies. Now, you might think that that was a triumph for the colonizers, but what do you think some people felt about that who'd been used to doing that? Do you think everyone liked that idea? Well, obviously, there was going to be a battle at the end of this, so some people really didn't like that idea. So, if you think the locals liked destroying their idols and that they were sort of doing as they were told by the Spanish, whatever your answer is to that, if Magellan had simply patted himself on the back at this point for a proselytizing job well done and gone about his business, he would have been fine. But Magellan, bless him, wanted to make sure that his converts stayed converts. And so he took everything further. He took it one step further, but also one step too far. And just this intention, just this thing of, I just want to do one more thing, is why tragedy befell the fleet. Because what happened here was Magellan wanted to seal the alliance with the king of Cebu by attacking the neighboring island of Mactan, whose king was an enemy of Cebu, and he would not convert to Christianity. So what Magellan wanted to do was sort of leave an indelible impression on the locals, say, you know, Christianity is going to be the dominant force here. What do you think the folks on Mactan thought about that idea? And that then led to the Battle of Mactan. On 27 April 1521, Magellan was killed and the Spaniards defeated by natives in the Battle of Mactan in the Philippines. By the way, I've visited the Philippines. If you like, I'll try and put a couple of photos of myself in the Philippines in this on this channel. But that's the short version of the story. The longer version is a tale of tragic ambitions and even more tragic overreach. Some local Cebuano men followed Magellan to Mactan. This is the longest story. But they were instructed by Magellan not to join the fight, but merely to watch. I think that was also a big mistake. Now, what do you think? Was he trying to demonstrate European eminence here? Now apparently he first sent an envoy to Lapu-Lapu, that's the king of Mactan, offering him a last chance to accept the king of Spain as their ruler and avoid bloodshed. But Lapu-Lapu refused. Magellan took just 49 men to the shore, while 11 remained to guard the boats. And I think what he anticipated could have or should have happened here was that they could use their cannons to fire onto the locals right from the ships. But the problem was the area surrounding the islands was quite shallow, and so they couldn't get their ships into range, right? And so, although there were only 49 men, they were anticipating that they could use the cannons on board their ships, and that was another big mistake. And so, although they had the benefit of relatively advanced armor, right, that they could wear, and weaponry, they were greatly outnumbered. Pigafetta said that, and he was actually present on the battlefield, this person who was writing about the events, he estimated the enemy at 1,500, so 50 versus 1,500. It's quite a mismatch. And so Magellan's forces were driven back and decisively defeated. No surprise there. Magellan himself died in this battle along with several comrades, including Cristóvão Rebelo, and that's Magellan's illegitimate son. Well, that's also the short version. The even longer version is that Magellan led his men ashore, and what they did was they burned 30 houses belonging to the locals. What do you think the locals felt about that? And that is one way to get 1,500 people's attention. And then they counterattacked relentlessly. I mean, if your home was burnt down, how would you feel? And so they were forced back into the water. They were forced basically off the island, and it was sort of in knee-deep, hip-deep water that Magellan and his men continued fighting. And the artillery on board their ships, as I say, was out of range and useless. If they thought that they could rely on that, well, that was obviously a mistake. And so what ultimately happened was a poisoned arrow hit Magellan in the leg. And in your mind, you might want to imagine the sounds of waves breaking in the background, and trying to move in water. And so this poisoned arrow was the first thing that hit Magellan in the leg, and then a spear caught him in the arm, then another spear, and then he went down surrounded by the enemy. According to Pigafetta, all at once rushed upon him with lances of iron and of bamboo, and with these javelins, so that they slew our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. Well, he was also someone who led them astray. This was a totally unnecessary sideshow. He goes on to say, while those people were striking him, he several times turned back to see whether we were all at the ships. Then, seeing him dead, as best we could, we rescued the wounded men and put them into the boats which were already leaving. And so this is the bottom line. On April 27th, 1521, Magellan died at the age of just 41, and his body was never recovered. So he goes out to sea, gets halfway around the world, and then he actually basically almost like a astronaut going onto a foreign planet, almost like you see in Star Trek. His body is left there, and the ship then sails on. Now imagine that. Imagine lying there, almost like a wounded Neil Armstrong on the moon. You've made history, but then you did something stupid, and now the world is going to make you famous, but without you in it. The flip side of all this is that you might think of Magellan as some kind of hero, but that's not how the Filipinos think of him even today. I mean, how heroic is it burning down 30 houses because somebody believes differently to you do? How would that go down today? So for them, their hero is the dude who killed Magellan. The Filipinos suffered 150 casualties, the Spaniards 14. The West may see Magellan as a brave soul who made world history, but others see him as a pirate and a thief, a colonizer and a crook. So who is the criminal here, and what's the crime, given that context? And then what happened next? So what happened next was the surviving members of the expedition couldn't decide who should succeed Magellan, and the men finally chose a joint command with the leadership divided between Duarte Barbosa and João Serrao, right? Then within 4 days, these two were also killed. They were either killed or poisoned after being betrayed on May 1st by the host at a friendly feast given by Raja Humabon. So you kind of have this big battle was in a way a big red flag to say, guys, maybe you want to avoid this and just stick to your mission parameter. But they still didn't learn their lesson. They continued associating with the locals, And the short version is that towards the end of a meal, a feast they were having on Cebu, and bear in mind the Cebuans had actually seen now what had happened on Mactan. You think they liked that idea? And so these armed Cebuans entered the hall and murdered the Europeans. 27 men were killed. So that about evened the score. I mean, on the battlefield, only 14 Europeans were killed. Off it, more than twice as many were taken out using sleight of hand. Juan Serrano, one of the newly elected co-commanders, was left alive and brought to the shore facing the Spanish ships. Serrano begged the men on board to pay a ransom, and the Cebuans wanted some of these modern weapons. They'd seen them in action, and the captain said, please pay the ransom to the Cebuans. But the Spanish wouldn't do that, and they left the port, and as a result, Serrano was presumably killed. And I think they chose Serrano because he was one of the co-commanders, that they thought that the men would be loyal to him, and obviously they weren't. So much for warm and fuzzy solidarity between crewmates. The mission was now teetering on the edge of disaster, and so what happened was João Lopes de Carvalho, he took command of the fleet, and what he would now do would be to lead them through the Philippine archipelago on a kind of meandering journey, and that would get them to the Spice Islands. And so this is really where they were at this point, hanging on by a thread. The fate of the fleet was really kind of in peril. At this point, are they going to complete their voyage around the world? Because they've reached halfway, and they've reached a sort of area that the Portuguese are familiar with. That they are familiar with this part of the world. So all they've got to do is complete the journey. But they are also so close to disaster. They can't even retrieve Magellan's body. They've lost another 30 men. But do you see, the real peril on this voyage wasn't the unknown. It wasn't storms or disease. It was their own weakness, their own greed, their own lust for power. The greatest danger men faced heading out to conquer or circumnavigate the world was themselves. And so, having reduced the number of survivors, those who remained decided to reduce the number of ships to 2. Can you believe it? What they did at this point was they set fire to the Concepcion. That is one of the 5 ships at this point. Now there are only 2 ships left. And they instead boarded the Trinidad, and now there are only 2 ships left, the Trinidad and the Victoria. And so on the way to the Moluccas, they chose Juan Elcano as their leader. The captain, João Carvalho, who had survived this trap, in terms of the feast, he became the captain of the Victoria. Then in August, they approached Borneo, that's in Indonesia. Then he was deposed, and Juan Sebastian Elcano became captain, that's of the Victoria, for the remainder of the expedition. He would be the captain that would triumphantly return to Spain. And so in November 1521, they eventually arrived at the Spice Islands, their ultimate destination, which is in the Moluccas. And the Portuguese had reached this earlier via the Indian Ocean, and this had been Magellan's goal all along. They had sailed west halfway around the world on uncharted seas. And so a trading post was established in Tidore, and the men set about purchasing cloves in exchange for goods such as cloth, knives, and glassware. And so, in a way, it was a success. Even just with 2 ships remaining, actually even 1 ship remaining, 1 ship that would actually ultimately return to Spain, they actually covered their losses. Then around 15 December, they decided to basically return home laden with cloves. But the other ship, the Trinidad, was in trouble. It was sort of needing maintenance. It was taking on water. And so the Trinidad had to postpone its departure while the men tried to find and repair the leak. And for some reason, they couldn't seem to fix the Trinidad. And so what they decided in the end was that the Victoria would leave for Spain via the western route, in other words, the same route that the Portuguese would take, which was in a way dangerous because the Portuguese, if they caught a Spanish ship in those waters, would be basically pirate fodder. So that was quite a dangerous thing to do. Meanwhile, what the Trinidad did was they would stock up on rations, try and control the leak, and they thought they would try and get back to Spain via the Pacific route. Now, you might say that they did that because the ship was kind of broken. They couldn't afford some kind of battle with other ships. But now what they're going to do is go all the way back across the Pacific. No! Anyway, all the way back east and back to Spain by heading across the Pacific towards Panama, and that involved an overland passage across the American continent. And so this attempt failed. The Trinidad was captured by the Portuguese and then eventually wrecked in a storm while at anchor under Portuguese control. So that was the end of that Trinidad story. And so there's only one ship left of the 5, one ship left. On December 21st, 1521, the Victoria sailed from Tidore in Indonesia alone. She traveled west toward Africa and then beyond back to Spain. It took Victoria 7 weeks to get past the Cape of Good Hope, and so she was facing really strong winds. And in these 7 weeks, another part of the crew, which started coming very close to mutiny as well. They've come so far, and there's still this competition for what should we do. And they were getting sick, they were hungry, and they demanded that the captain land in Mozambique, which is where the Portuguese had established themselves. And they didn't want to do that because this was a Spanish mission. And so despite Magellan's nationality, it was not a Portuguese expedition, and Elcano was not going to let himself or his men and his valuable cargo fall into the hands of the Portuguese. And so despite their their suffering, despite the adversity, he forced the crew to continue the route to the west. And so the thing that they had to withstand there was temptation. Now we're going to continue following the voyage of Victoria up to the Cape Verde Islands in the next episode, the third and final episode. But before we leave off, one final order of business based on what we've discovered today. Lessons learned. This story about Magellan wasn't just about geography and anthropology. It showed something philosophical, that it's all one world. And that's according to Bergreen. Lawrence Bergreen, a U.S. historian, is also the author of a biography on Magellan. I'm quoting from an article in phys.org titled 500 Years on How Magellan's Voyage Changed the World. The article also notes, quote, before Magellan, people didn't really know that. They didn't know how the world was connected or how big it was. And so this was really important to give us a sense of scale, how big the world was, how small we were, how to deal, where we fit in on this planet, how other people also fit in. And then while crossing the Magellan Strait, the explorer and his crew, this is something quite incredible. They observed 2 galaxies visible to the naked eye from the southern hemisphere. And that is something else that was bequeathed to us essentially thanks to this trip around the world. And so these are known as the Magellanic Clouds, these 2 galaxies visible to the naked eye. The lessons we learn from Magellan are how to prepare for an epic journey into the unknown. The key factor is psychological preparedness. Be prepared to be uncomfortable. Be prepared to learn and not get hurt. But perhaps most important of all, stay humble and don't stray from the mission parameters. Besides the lessons learned, I think there's also something very inspirational about Magellan's achievement. His achievement was a landmark in the history of exploration. It's still hailed by people today, modern-day explorers. According to Dafford Williams, a former NASA astronaut, 65 years old, who went on 2 space missions, he said, in the space program, to prepare for these long duration missions, we say the lessons for the future are written in the past. And so he also says so many in the space program have read about Magellan. And you can imagine going out into space, this black void, this infinite black void. Reading about Magellan gives you an idea how to deal with the unknown, how to also survive the unknown. And what is also interesting is we have chapters almost like the Van Gogh letters of Pigafetta's chronicles. And if you're interested, we can kind of go through a couple of them. The last thing to say is, for the Filipinos, the inspiring story here isn't how Magellan lived or what he achieved, but how Magellan was killed by one of their own. And what I think that shows is a different perspective of humanity of itself. The one is a big scale idea of ourselves, and the other one is a sort of idea of trying to just protect your home and trying to protect your family. And I think the difficult thing is to reconcile both of these two views. That is there a way to explore without hurting someone else? Is there a way to explore by taking everyone's interests into account? Has NASA figured that out? Has SpaceX figured that out? Have you figured that out in your exploration? Is it necessary to burn 30 houses in order to get where you want to go, to make your point? And so I think part of this idea of discovery, there's a sort of a military aspect to it. There's a aggressive aspect to it. And one does wonder, would you make these discoveries if you took that away? What do you think? Thank you for listening. Keep weaving, and I'll see you guys next time.